There are moments in life, quiet, unannounced, and yet impossible to ignore, when something within you begins to stir, not as noise, but as a knowing, not as urgency, but as an ache. It doesn't shout, it barely whispers, and yet, it changes everything. It often begins with a sense that the life you're living is too small for something vast that's waking inside you. A subtle but persistent feeling that the stories you've built around who you are no longer hold your weight, and that perhaps, just perhaps, your soul is asking for something deeper than healing, brighter than growth, and truer than the light you thought was final. Maybe you've awakened once already. You glimpsed the divine. You shed illusions. You softened. You changed. You became a seeker, a light worker, a truth finder, and for a while it was enough. But now the silence returns. The clarity blurs. The fire quiets. And beneath it all, a second voice rises. Not new, but deeper. This is the second awakening. Not louder, not grander, but far more honest. It comes not to lift you above the world, but to strip you of everything that kept you from being fully here. It asks not who you want to become, but what you are willing to let go of. And that's what this video is about. In this video, we'll walk together through the 10 deep stages of spiritual awakening. Not the first wave of light, but the second current, the one that pulls you into your own stillness, your own undoing, your own infinite becoming. Each stage is not a rule, but a rhythm, a spiral the soul remembers even when the mind forgets. If something in you feels like it's falling apart again, if you're not confused but quietly undone, if your peace feels old and your truth feels new, then you may already be walking the second path. If this resonates, let the space hold you. Like this video, not for the algorithm, but to affirm your presence. Subscribe not as a follower, but as a fellow soul walking through mystery. And if you're currently moving through this second unraveling, leave a comment below. Not to explain, just to say, I'm here, I feel it too. Because the second awakening can feel isolating, but you are not alone. You are never alone. You are simply returning, again, to the part of you that was never separate. Stage 1. The whisper of awakening when your soul calls again. There is a kind of beginning that does not feel like a beginning at all, no loud shift, no sudden upheaval, no divine lightning tearing through the veil. Only a soft murmur, a subtle ache, a presence that sits just beneath the surface of your daily life, asking nothing of you, and yet asking everything. It may arrive in the middle of your routine, while brushing your teeth, folding laundry, or walking a familiar path home. And yet, in that ordinary moment, something opens, something that cannot be seen but can be undeniably felt, as if the world around you, though unchanged, is suddenly unable to hold the shape of your being. You may have awakened once before, felt the veil lift, felt the beauty of interconnectedness, touched the edge of something holy and true. You may have softened your heart, released long-held pain, healed parts of yourself you thought were beyond redemption. You may have even started to believe that you had arrived, that the road had narrowed into clarity and you knew who you were. But now, without announcement or warning, the certainty dissolves. The language you once used to describe your truth begins to crumble in your mouth. The practices that once held you begin to lose their flavor. The you that felt so clear and grounded begins to fade into mist. And in the quiet that follows, a question arises, not loud, not urgent, but undeniably sacred. What if everything you've known was only the first layer? This is not a regression. This is not a crisis. This is the whisper of a deeper unfolding, the call of the soul not to grow, but to shed, not to rise, but to descend, not to become someone new, but to remember someone ancient, someone honest, someone wordless. The second awakening does not seek your performance. It does not care how wise you sound, how many books you've read, how well you've healed. It simply asks if you are willing to let go, not of your illusions, but of your identity as the one who let them go. And so it begins again, not as a search, but as a surrender. Not as a doing, but as a dissolving. Not with fireworks, but with stillness. If you feel this soft unraveling, if your soul has begun to shift beneath the surface, not in fear, but in quiet invitation, then you are already listening. You don't need to understand. You only need to stay. Because this is the beginning again. And this time it does not shout. It whispers. Stage 2, outgrowing the old self, when your previous identity no longer fits. There comes a time, so subtle that you may miss it at first, when the shape of your life no longer seems to hold the shape of your soul. The person you have been, so familiar, so practiced, so functional, suddenly begins to feel like a costume, stitched together by necessity and held up by expectations that no longer resonate with the silent truth emerging from within. You may still look the same on the outside. You may still go through the same motions, speak the same language, play the same roles, wear the same names others have come to rely on. But underneath it all, a quiet unraveling begins. The words you used to say now feel hollow in your throat. The relationships you once clung to start to feel heavy, not because they are wrong, but because they no longer reflect the frequency of who you are becoming. At first, it may feel like discomfort, a vague restlessness, a lack of enthusiasm, a growing indifference to things that once defined your joy, your passion, your worth. But soon it becomes harder to pretend. You begin to feel like a stranger in your own life, as though you're living in a story that was once yours, but has since been handed down to someone else, someone you no longer are. And yet, you can't quite name the new shape either, because what's coming hasn't fully arrived. You're between versions of yourself, too conscious to return to the old, but not yet formed enough to fully embody the new. This is not an identity crisis. It is a spiritual transition, a sacred dismantling, a deep initiation into the freedom that only comes when you are willing to let go of who you think you are, even when nothing has yet come to replace it. The mind panics in this space. It wants clarity, resolution, a new name to grasp. But the soul moves in spirals, not straight lines. It asks you to dwell in the unknown, to remain soft in the middle of unmaking, to trust the silent intelligence of becoming without rushing to define what you are becoming. What's falling away is not failure. It's fulfillment. The roles, beliefs, identities, even the spiritual ones, that once helped you survive have done their job. They brought you here, and now, their weight is simply too much for wings you didn't know were forming. So if you find yourself in a place where everything feels off, where the mask no longer fits but your face still hides in shadows, take heart. You are not falling apart. You are falling inward. And in the space between the old and the new, something holy is breathing. It is not asking you to rise. It is asking you to release. Stage 3, the sacred emptiness, finding God in the void. There comes a phase in the awakening journey that few speak about, not because it is less important, but because it is less poetic, more silent than radiant, more unraveling than rising. It is a place not of insight, but of absence. Not of clarity, but of confusion. Not of light, but of an echoing darkness that holds no immediate answers, only space. This is the sacred emptiness. The in-between. The hollow ground where your old self no longer holds, but the new one has yet to be born. It is not depression, though it may feel like it. It is not despair, though it may flirt with that flavor. It is a deep internal pause, one orchestrated not by failure, but by intelligence. A kind of divine intermission, where your inner world is stripped bare, not to leave you barren, but to show you the parts of yourself that were built only to keep you busy, safe, or significant. In this stage, everything may feel dull. The practices that once uplifted you, meditation, ritual, connection, now feel like empty gestures. The truths that once moved you feel cliché. The vision you once held feels distant or irrelevant. Even your own presence feels unfamiliar, as if you're floating through a life that no longer echoes with meaning. And yet, something within you resists going back. Even if you don't know where you're going, you know what you're no longer willing to carry. You cannot unsee what you've seen, cannot unknow the falseness of the masks, even if you now feel naked without them. This emptiness is sacred not because it feels holy, but because it is honest. It strips away the embellishments, the spiritual ambitions, the polished language of growth, and leaves you face to face with your raw, wordless being. And though your mind may panic, your soul does not. Because this void is not the absence of meaning, it is the space that precedes the true meaning. It is the womb of new consciousness. And like all wombs, it is dark, silent, slow, and unseen. The world will not understand this part of your path. It will ask you to produce, to perform, to explain, to get back to yourself. But you will know, deep down, that this pause is not the enemy of progress. It is the soil of what's next. So if you find yourself in the quiet ruins of your former clarity, unable to pray, unable to push, unable to pretend, trust this space. You are not broken. You are becoming vast. You are not lost. You are being emptied of what you no longer need, so that you may carry only what is real. And in that emptiness, if you stay long enough, soft enough, still enough, you may begin to feel something subtle return. Not a voice, not a vision, but presence. And in that presence, you will find what no answer could ever give you. God, not as a concept, but as silence itself. Stage 4. The spiritual hunger, the pull toward something more. After the sacred emptiness comes a strange kind of yearning. Not loud, not desperate, not the kind of hunger that claws at your chest, but a deeper, older longing that rises not from your wounds, but from your remembering. It is as if something inside you has awakened with a craving that no book, no teacher, no mantra can truly satisfy. You may begin to feel pulled in strange directions, toward ancient texts whose meanings seem oddly familiar, toward traditions you've never studied but somehow feel like home, toward words you've never spoken yet carry the weight of something you once knew, long ago, beyond this life. It is not curiosity. It is not ambition. It is soul memory calling you back to a truth buried beneath the noise of lifetimes. This hunger is not for knowledge, but for essence. Not for information, but for integration. You no longer want to collect teachings. You want to become the teaching. You no longer wish to talk about truth. You want to dissolve into it. And yet, the world keeps offering you answers. Prepackaged, simplified, glossy. But they no longer satisfy, because this hunger is not about spiritual identity. It is about spiritual embodiment. You are no longer interested in sounding enlightened. You are interested in becoming empty enough to contain what is real. You may find yourself staying up late into the night, not out of anxiety, but because your inner world is burning with questions no one taught you to ask. Not questions of how to fix yourself, but of what you truly are, what existence itself is, and what it means to live without separation from the sacred, even in the middle of a mundane moment. And while others may speak of success, alignment, and manifesting the life of your dreams, you find yourself less interested in dreams and more compelled by what is undreamed, what cannot be imagined, only discovered, only revealed. This spiritual hunger is holy. It is the proof that your soul is still moving, still deepening, still unfolding. It is not a lack. It is an activation. And though it may ache, though it may bring with it frustration or fatigue, it is also the fire through which everything false burns away, so that only the essential can remain. You may not find what you are looking for quickly. You may wander, sit in silence, circle back, get lost again. But in truth, This hunger is not asking for a destination. It is asking for your surrender, your willingness to follow the pull, even when it leads you into mystery instead of clarity, even when it strips you of language and leaves you in stillness. And in that surrender, something begins to shift. You no longer ask the universe to explain itself. You no longer need every sign to point toward it. You begin to live inside the question itself. And somehow the hunger becomes nourishment. Because this is not a hunger for something more. It is a hunger for something truer. And that, dear one, is how your soul calls you home. Stage 5. The death of pretending. Radical honesty emerges. There arrives a moment on the spiritual path, quiet but unavoidable, when the structure of your self-image, however lovingly or mindfully it was crafted, begins to tremble beneath the weight of your deeper truth. It does not shatter all at once, nor does it ask for permission. Rather, it loosens like old roots in softened earth, and suddenly, without needing a reason, you can no longer pretend to be anything other than what you truly are, unguarded, imperfect, and profoundly human. In this stage, the spiritual mask begins to dissolve, not because you've failed at being awake, but because something within you has matured enough to recognize that even light can become a costume when worn too tightly. You start to see how easy it is to use soft words to avoid hard truths, how even the language of presence and compassion can be wielded to distance yourself from vulnerability, and how the spiritual identity itself can become a fortress guarding the very wounds it once vowed to heal. You feel it not as shame, but as quiet fatigue, the kind that seeps into your bones, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer able to carry the weight of contradiction between who you are and who you perform. The voice in your chest grows tired of curating wholeness. The soul aches not for purity, but for sincerity. And you begin to long for a kind of honesty so unvarnished, so unfiltered, that it doesn't even need to be explained. It simply lives in your breath, your posture, your tone, in the way you no longer flinch when someone sees you without your spiritual makeup on. This is not a descent into carelessness, nor is it a rejection of depth or discipline. It is, instead, a return to the unembellished sacredness of what it means to simply be, not as an example, not as a symbol, not as a guide, but as a breathing, breaking, mending, remembering soul willing to stop managing appearances in favor of resting in reality. You begin to say what you mean, even if it's messy. You begin to admit when you don't know, even if it used to terrify you. You begin to stop translating your truth into a language others will approve of, and instead allow it to emerge in its own raw dialect, without shame or performance. And yes, this honesty may disrupt the carefully balanced dynamics you've kept in place for years. It may unsettle relationships that were built on your willingness to be agreeable, on your capacity to manage everyone else's comfort. But within that disruption, something sacred stirs. The possibility of being loved not for your light, but for your wholeness. Because when you finally allow yourself to stop pretending, even to be wise, even to be healed, you make space for something far more powerful than perception. You make space for real connection, for honest presence, for the kind of silence that doesn't echo with pretense, but with truth. This is not the death of your becoming. It is the beginning of your belonging. Stage 6. The beauty of simplicity, when the ordinary becomes divine. There is a stage in the unfolding where the striving begins to soften, not because you've reached what you were seeking, but because something inside you quietly realizes that the seeking itself was part of the illusion. The questions, the quests, the endless refining of the self, the climbing toward transcendence, all begin to lose their gravity, not out of disillusionment, but from a recognition that the sacred you were trying to find was never far away, but always here, hidden in plain sight. In this spaciousness, the soul starts to reorient its attention, not toward more light, more insight, more growth, but toward the small things, the things that used to pass unnoticed, the ones that were too ordinary to be sacred back when you were still measuring your progress by how much higher you could go. You find yourself pausing mid-breath just to feel it, not to control or deepen it, but to honor its miracle. You look at a tree and no longer analyze its metaphor. You simply stand in its presence, as if it knows something your mind never will. You sit in silence not to empty yourself, but because the silence feels full in a way that words never did. And slowly, a kind of reverence returns. One that doesn't need altars or incense or chants, but bows quietly to the sunlight on your skin, to the softness of folded laundry, to the rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement, to the sacred, invisible ceremony of a cup of warm tea held between your hands after a long day. You begin to realize that spirituality was never about becoming something more, but about becoming available to the miracle of the mundane, available to the holiness of repetition, available to the subtle beauty that had always been there, waiting for your gaze to slow down enough to see it. The world no longer needs to impress you with visions. It only needs you to be still enough to witness it, raw and unadorned. Because now, you no longer crave the extraordinary. You are learning how to let the ordinary become extraordinary by the sheer fact of your presence. In this stage, the ego's fascination with significance begins to dissolve, and in its place, a quieter intelligence rises. One that doesn't want to stand out, but to blend into life so completely that there is no separation between the observer and the observed, between the sacred and the simple, between you and what is. And though you may not be able to explain this shift in words, you begin to feel it in the way your body moves more slowly, in how your voice becomes softer, in how your preferences give way to wonder, in how you no longer ask what the moment can give you, but what it wants you to see. Because now, you are not seeking the divine through effort. You are meeting it through simplicity. And in that meeting, there is nothing to become, only something ancient to return to. Stage 7. Shifting soul contracts, who stays, who leaves. As you begin to walk deeper into the second spiral of awakening, you will notice that something starts to shift in the fabric of your relationships. Not in a dramatic way, not in sudden explosions or final words, but in a subtle thinning, a quiet untethering, like threads that once held tight beginning to loosen gently without blame, without resistance, and often without explanation. You may find yourself sitting across from someone you've loved for years and sensing a quiet dissonance that wasn't there before. A space between you that no words can bridge, not because of conflict, but because your energy no longer fits inside the same shared container. It's as if your souls signed a silent agreement long ago, promising to walk together only until a certain threshold, and now that threshold has been reached. The contract is expiring, not in anger, but in grace. This stage does not come to sever love, it comes to refine it. It teaches you to let go without closing your heart, to release without building walls, to bless the ones who leave your field without needing to make them wrong. It asks you to trust that your evolution will inevitably reshape your circles, not because you're better or wiser or more spiritual, but because vibration reorganizes life without asking permission. And yes, it hurts, not because you want everyone to stay, but because you once believed that deep love should always survive awakening. But now, you're beginning to understand. Some people were never meant to walk with you forever. They were sent for a season, a lesson, a mirror, a memory, and when that season ends, the clinging becomes the wound. You may try to explain your shift, to speak your new truth with tenderness, but find that it lands like static on ears not tuned to the frequency of your becoming. And so, you stop speaking so much. You stop defending your growth. You stop translating your silence into language for others to understand. You begin to allow the distance to be holy. And while some connections fade, others arrive. Suddenly, you meet someone whose presence feels like home without history. The conversation flows as if your souls are catching up, not beginning. You don't have to explain your transformation, they recognize it because they're living it too. These are your resonance companions, not replacements for the ones who left, but reflections of the one you are now becoming. They do not demand consistency. They honor fluidity. They speak in energy, not just in words. And they remind you love does not end, it evolves. In this stage, you stop measuring relationships by their longevity and start honoring them for their authenticity, for the depth they awaken, for the freedom they allow. You begin to understand that spiritual connection is not about keeping everyone close. It's about holding everyone lightly, allowing the soul to choose its alignments again and again, without guilt, without force. So if you're mourning the quiet distance that has grown between you and someone you once called your forever, know this: your soul is not betraying love. It is learning how to love more truly. And those who are meant for your next chapter, they will not require you to shrink in order to stay. Stage 8. Embracing the shadow, loving what you used to reject. At some point in the spiral of awakening, when the layers of identity have peeled back far enough and the illusions of light have grown thin, there comes a quiet yet profound invitation. Not to transcend your darkness, not to purify it, not to rise above it, but to turn toward it with the kind of attention that no longer flinches, no longer categorizes, no longer demands it change in order to be worthy of your love. You begin to notice that the parts of yourself you were once so desperate to heal, your anger, your envy, your fear, your need, your sadness, are not asking to be fixed, but simply to be felt, to be held, to be seen not as errors in your code, but as ancient intelligences formed in the fire of survival, shaped by pain and silence, longing not for discipline, but for your unguarded presence. This stage does not begin with confrontation, but with fatigue. You grow tired, not just of running from your shadow, but of the exhausting performance of light. You realize that pretending to be endlessly peaceful, relentlessly positive, constantly above it all has not brought you closer to truth. It has only created a new prison, gilded this time but confining all the same. And so, with trembling heart and quiet breath, you begin to descend, not in failure but in reverence, into the terrain of your own rejected self, not to wage war, but to offer witness. You stop asking your darkness to transform into light and instead begin to ask, "What have you been trying to tell me all this time?" And what you find there is not chaos, it is clarity. You begin to see that your anger once arose in defense of your boundaries, that your sadness protected your sensitivity, that your shame grew from a life lived in rooms that punished your truth. You begin to trace the roots of your so-called flaws and realize they are not weeds, but wildflowers planted in desperate soil, doing their best to bloom in harsh light. In embracing your shadow, you are not choosing brokenness, you are choosing wholeness. Because light without shadow is blindness, and love that only loves what is lovable is not love at all. This is the moment you stop asking to be cleansed and start asking to be complete. You realize that healing is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present to all of you, especially the parts you once tried to exile from your own compassion. And in this radical self-embrace, you may notice something sacred shift, not just in your relationship to yourself, but to others. You become less reactive, less judgmental, more curious, more tender, because when you have looked into the eyes of your own darkness and chosen to stay, you no longer fear the shadow in others. You recognize it, you bow to it, you hold space for it not as weakness, but as a mirror of shared humanity. So if you find yourself being drawn not toward more light, but into the dense, tender dark of your inner world, follow it. You are not regressing, you are becoming whole. You are not sinking, you are softening into the truth that what you once called darkness was simply the part of you still waiting to be loved. Stage 9. Trusting the flow, living from alignment, not control. There comes a point, usually after the shedding, the silence, the shadow, when something profound begins to shift, not in the structure of your life, but in the way you relate to it. What once felt like an urgent need to manage, to direct, to control every detail, every outcome, every piece of your path, begins to feel impossibly heavy, not because you've given up, but because your soul has outgrown the illusion that control was ever truly yours to begin with. You begin to sense that life, if left undisturbed, has its own rhythm, its own intelligence, its own timing, and that your attempts to push, to force, to orchestrate what you think should be unfolding are often the very thing that blocks the grace already trying to move through you. At first, this recognition can feel destabilizing, especially if you were taught to equate surrender with passivity or trust with naivety. Letting go of control feels dangerous to the part of you that survived by planning ahead, by holding tight, by always knowing what's next. And yet, something deeper whispers, you're safe to stop striving. You're safe to rest into the current. You begin to release the compulsion to manifest, to hustle, to design every inch of your destiny, and instead you start listening. You listen to the subtleties of your energy, to the timing of your yes and no, to the resonance in your body when something aligns or resists. You no longer ask life to obey your timeline. Instead, you ask your heart what time it is inside your own being. And slowly, your decisions change. You move not from fear, not from strategy, not from what will be perceived as smart or right, but from a felt sense of alignment so honest that you would rather disappoint someone else than betray your own inner compass. Trusting the flow does not mean abandoning discernment. It does not mean floating aimlessly, waiting passively for signs. It means recognizing that your intuition is not just a feeling, it is a frequency, and when you are attuned to it, life begins to move with you, not against you. You stop chasing what resists. You stop fixing what isn't yours to hold. You stop running toward what no longer invites your presence. And in return, the flow brings to you what your effort could never reach: connections that feel effortless, timing that feels divine, opportunities that emerge not because you hunted them down, but because you made space for them to arrive. There is a quiet power in living like this, not passive but participatory, not rigid but rooted. You learn to take inspired action not because you're afraid of missing out, but because something deeper in you says, now. And you learn to pause not because you're stuck, but because the river is asking you to wait for the next current to catch you. So if your hands are tired from holding, if your mind is weary from managing, if your heart is aching from trying to force what no longer fits, let it go. There is something wiser than you moving through you, and it knows exactly where you're going. Stage 10. The return to inner silence, becoming what you are. At the end of all the seeking, beyond the words and the wounds, past the stages and stories, even past the healing, there comes a silence. Not the kind that happens when noise disappears, but the kind that remains when there is no longer anything left to say, not because everything has been answered, but because the need for answers has dissolved into something far more vast than understanding. This is not the silence of isolation. It is the silence of essence, a stillness that does not feel empty, but alive, not quiet because nothing moves, but because nothing needs to move, because in this silence, there is no one left to chase, no one left to convince, no one left to become. You no longer feel the urge to define your truth. You simply live it, not with effort, not with identity, but as a frequency so native to your being that you forget it's even there. Like the beat of your heart, like the breath in your lungs, like the sky behind every weather pattern that has ever passed through. In this stage, the concept of awakening itself begins to fade. You stop asking if you're enlightened. You stop measuring how far you've come. You stop narrating your own evolution, not because you no longer care, but because something in you has relaxed so deeply into what is, that becoming someone has given way to being no one, and in that, everyone. There is no performance left, no hidden ambition to sound wise, no desire to save or fix or awaken others. You realize that truth does not need your defense, that light does not need your polish, that presence does not need your permission. You simply begin to live quietly, wholly, from the center. And that living, though invisible to many, becomes medicine for those who are ready to feel beyond words. This silence is not a void. It is a return. It is the place you never actually left, the place you tried to earn your way back to, only to discover that it was with you, within you, as you all along. You look at the sky and no longer seek signs. You hear a child laugh and no longer try to translate it into metaphor. You feel the wind pass through your body and you do not ask what it means. You simply feel it, and in that feeling, the world becomes enough. You are not trying to embody light. You are light, embodied. You are not trying to speak truth. You have become silence in motion, and the most beautiful part of it all, you don't need anyone to know. You don't even need to know it yourself, because truth, once fully integrated, ceases to announce itself. So if you find yourself less interested in noise, less reactive to questions, less compelled to prove, explain, or even speak, Welcome. You have not lost your path. You have simply stepped beyond it. You are not lost. You are unlabeled. You are not becoming. You are home. Conclusion: awakening is a spiral, not a line. If you've made it this far, it's likely not because you were looking for more information. It's because something in you already knew, already remembered, and simply needed a mirror, a language, a space wide enough to hold what you couldn't quite name, yet felt in the quietest corners of your becoming. And so here you are, not at the end, but at the edge of another beginning. Because if there's one thing this journey reveals with clarity, it is this: awakening is not a destination. It is a spiral. You do not arrive once and for all. You arrive, dissolve, forget, remember, break, rebuild, soften, and then begin again, each time deeper, truer, quieter than the last. The first awakening showed you that the world was not what it seemed. The second showed you that you were not who you seemed. And what comes next, what always comes next, is not about becoming someone more, but someone less defined, less defended, more transparent to the mystery that moves through all things, including you. By now, you've likely noticed, the more awake you become, the less you need to say. The more deeply you see, the less you need to explain. The closer you come to truth, the less it even feels like your truth, because you realize truth is not personal. It is presence. And presence does not belong to anyone. It is everyone. There will still be moments where the ego returns, where the fear creeps back in, where you forget, where you ache, where you seek again. But now you will meet those moments with more kindness, not as failures, but as thresholds. You will stop trying to stay awake and instead learn how to fall asleep consciously and wake gently again and again, like the tide remembering the shore. Awakening, in its truest form, is not a light show. It is not fireworks or certainty or grand pronouncements. It is the quiet, daily practice of being with what is, without resistance, without excess, without the need to name every wave of your experience as either success or regression. It is learning how to breathe inside the questions. It is learning how to bow when clarity doesn't come. It is knowing that God is not found in higher states, but in deeper stillness. And that stillness is not something you enter. It is what you are when all effort falls away. So if you feel like you're still unraveling, good. If you don't quite know who you are anymore, good. If the things that once defined you no longer hold weight, good. Because all of this is proof not that you're lost, but that you've stopped clinging to the map and begun to trust the terrain of your own soul. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be real. You are not here to become enlightened. You are here to remember what cannot be forgotten. You are not here to finish the journey. You are here to live it fully, honestly, and gently, one breath, one spiral, one sacred unbecoming at a time. So let go of the need to close this story with a ribbon. Let it end the way all things real do, without a finish line, only a soft return. To silence. To presence. To the you that was never lost. Only waiting to be heard beneath all that you were trying to become. Welcome home.